While collaborating with Messrs. Balanchine and Kirstein, Maestro Barzin continued the work he had begun years earlier in Hartford, when he created an educational outreach program to develop future audiences for classical music. Drawing upon this initial pilot program for area schools, Barzin created a new National Orchestral Association initiative that was soon expanded into an annual series of tours to Delaware schools for students in the 5th to 7th grades. The small ensemble that Barzin brought to the schools demonstrated the flute, oboe, clarinet, French horn, and bassoon. One school would host the sessions, of which there were typically 4 or 5 on each day of the tour, bringing in children from the other schools so as to minimize travel time for the ensemble and maximize the number of children exposed to each session. This format was later replicated in visits to Connecticut and Long Island schools. In these sessions, Barzin invited children up to the stage so they would have intimate contact with the musicians and encouraged them to touch the instruments. Barzin himself was inspired by the intimate contact he had experienced with the orchestra as a child, sitting in the pit of the Metropolitan Opera watching Toscanini up close, and he hoped to inspire future generations in the same way.
Throughout his career, Barzin was a restless innovator. He had to find things that were new, that were not in existence or extant at a given moment, and consequently, he would create things such as going into schools and taking 6, 8, 10 players with him. And he was phenomenal with the children in these school situations. He was invited back again and again. There was that very, very successful trip to Delaware where he went into Wilmington schools and just had an enormous success. And so a year later they did it again, but this time he was asked to go downstate in Delaware to Dover and other downstate, Salisbury perhaps, Maryland. Today we have young artists. It's a program where professional musicians go into the schools, and this sort of was the precursor of that program, or at least the beginning of thinking about such things.
Maestro Barzin believed that developing an audience was as important as training an orchestra.
One trouble with music in America is not with our artists, but with our audiences. Community managers are much more concerned with filling the house than with the cultural growth of the community. They engage great names that will draw. And you'll find, upon inquiry, that most audiences, even in the larger cities, go to orchestral concerts to hear this or that conductor. But if you ask individuals what program they intend to hear, the majority will confess a complete ignorance of the music to be played. I believe the time has come when we must look to the future to develop our audiences. What better place than in the classrooms of our institutions of learning? Many of these thousands of youngsters have a natural curiosity about music and no way in which to satisfy this curiosity. I have done some experimental work in this respect. Realizing that sound alone means little to a child between the ages of 6 and 11, I have made music visible and encourage all sorts of questions and actual participation by the child in what is going on. I had 5 string players on the platform of the auditorium. I explained the characteristics of each instrument, how they are played, something of how they are made. The children came up on stage, stood behind each player, handled the instruments, and asked questions. And then we played tunes. Some they liked, others they didn't. At no time was the name of the composer mentioned. They danced and played games and made up little stories. It was fun even for the teachers. And when the hour was done, everybody had learned something about music.
Mr. Barzin had a very extraordinary idea relating to education in that he felt that kids and people should come very close to the instruments. Not only that they should see them from far away and hear you talk about them and have question and answers, but he felt that they should come up close and actually touch the instrument. And a lot of musicians, I guess myself included, who have these very expensive instruments are a little bit fearful. We're a little leery of having someone come up, some 7-year-old, and just sort of touch our violin. But he said, don't be afraid. because they realize that it's something very valuable, and they'll touch it with care. And he was right, that the kids realize that it's something when they come up, they just don't touch it like a baseball or a football. They come up and they realize that it's something to be cherished, and they're very gracious with it. And that, I was very surprised by that.
There was really very, very good education going on. He wanted to augment it. He wanted to make it more real. He wanted to have actual players there that could play together at a high level, so that the students could hear this good music of quintets or quartets or whatever, and leave the students with that auditory sensation of quality chamber playing. He also did a lot of explaining of the instruments. There was one situation where there was a very valuable bass, a double bass. There was that one child wanted to come up and asked if he could touch the bass. And the bass player was a little nervous, and Barzin calmed him down and said, "Nothing will happen to your bass." And so the student touched it and got up close and personal with it, and it was a thrill. And nothing happened to the bass.